Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today I'm going to be discussing this book, For the Wolf. Now, this is an interesting retelling, kind of reimagining of a couple different fairy tales in one. On one hand, the praise on the back mentions Beauty and the Beast, but it also mentions Little Red Riding Hood, and this kind of blends the two, though Little Red Riding Hood more aesthetically, and Beauty and the Beast more thematically. Also, I don't know why I picked this up off the shelves. I like good designs, and figured this may be a good reimagining of these stories, but it's also so far out of my normal wheelhouse that, like I said, I'm not entirely certain why I actually picked it up off the shelves, but suffice it to say, I did and I enjoyed it, though maybe not necessarily for all the reasons that the normal reader of this book would. I'm not usually a reader of, like, romantasy, and this is solidly one of those kinds of books. But also, I'm not necessarily interested in it for the world building either. And this is one of those things where, like, there is an audience for it. I am part of that audience, but very fringe in a way. This book is a story where it's got a ancient kingdom, and that's kind of typical for fairy tales. It's matrilineal, which isn't as typical, but the family, every generation has two daughters. One who takes the throne, and the other who is sacrificed to this forest, specifically sacrificed to the wolf. And it's got a weird way of doing that, in that, like, the kingdom treats it as a sacrifice, and that's functionally what it is, and there's a lot of faith built up around the land being protected by the princess, who protects the land from the wolf that lives in this forest. And so long as the princess sacrifices herself to a specific tree, and not like in a human sacrificey way, or at least the princess goes off into the forest in the ceremonial garb just being the red hood and cloak that the first princess wore when she went off into the forest. And as it turns out, it's not the wolf that is bad, but the forest that is bad, and the wolf is one of the protectors. But the wolf is also the lover of the first princess, and his reputation has been dragged through the mud for centuries now. And so everyone sees him as the villain in the story. Obviously, that makes it a whole Beauty and the Beast kind of thing. She goes off and, does Beauty and the Beast things in the forest with the wolf. That's basically how this story plays out. But like I said, it wears the trappings of a Little Red Riding Hood story very aesthetically, but thematically, it is one of those Beauty and the Beast stories. It didn't necessarily pop out at me, any of the prose, any of the writing, any of the tone in it. It was one of those books that was relatively easy to read, and it moved quickly once I actually focused on it. But also, to be brutally honest, I read this while driving cross country last year for the river trail trip that I did with my dad in August and September. I read this over my lap doing this. And that's not a good or safe way to drive. I am telling everyone here, don't do this. But another book I read, I'll actually rant about it next, for next week's video, that is. I read both while driving in that way. The first one because it was a short, like 120, 130 page long story. And that one was really easy and quick to read while driving from Alamogordo, New Mexico to the interstate in Texas. I took just straight across through Hobbs, through western Texas. That was just, I think it's technically Panhandle, Texas, but it never was clear to me why the portions of Texas are named the way they are, especially since El Paso isn't in West Texas, despite it being the westernmost point in Texas. But yeah, I read both of those books during that time frame because it was like there was nothing else to do out there in the first place. So that was an interesting way to read it. Like I said, it read really quickly. I actually read the other book. I'll probably do it another time now that I think about it. But that other book was short, it was quick, and I was already finished with it by the time I hit the interstate. And then when I did hit the interstate, I was reading this, and a thing about the interstate, especially in larger states like Texas, is that even when there are other cars on the road, it's incredibly easy to be distracted and not crash. And that's because outside of the cities, there's usually a couple hundred yards between you and the next person. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't... I read this while on the road, while at the hotels during the nights. I stopped after Texas. I want to say I stopped in Tennessee, and then from Tennessee to Virginia. It just was really easy to read this quickly. And then once I had finished it, I then started reading, what was it? The Falcon Thief. So during that one trip, I ended up reading several books, and this was just one of them. It was very fairy tale. It was very political drama-y. It was very romantic-y. Not the sort of thing that I usually read. There was almost no action, and when there was, it was very predictable. So, yeah, that was not a very long rant. There's not much to say about this book, just because, like, as I said, it's quick. None of the prose stands out to me. I probably wouldn't read this ever again. Not because it's bad, but just because it's not good. It's run-of-the-mill, and that was about it. And I want to say it was interesting, mostly, like I said, because of that Beauty and the Beast theme, but aesthetically Little Red Riding Hood. It was just, there wasn't anything more to it. It was interesting because I don't read that kind of book in the first place, so getting that kind of story is different. But it's not different to fantasy overall. It's just, I don't read that stuff, not, it isn't out there. And as far as the Beauty and the Beast kind of stories go, this was just okay. So, yeah, there's not much else to say about this one. It's a book one. I'm never going to read book two. I'm never going to read this one again. And now that I have ranted about it, it's probably going to go back into the used bookstore system. Though, there is a comment on that I should say, which is, I have previously commented on and ranted about books from this place in Albuquerque called Page One Books. And I really like that bookstore. It's nice to support an independent bookstore. It's nice to support a bookstore that is primarily a used bookstore. But its store credit system is one of the worst I've ever seen. And I went there, I turned in like 6 books. I got a coupon slip for $7.50 off of my purchase, my next purchase with them. Whereas if I go to like Coas, which I'm probably going to put this back into, if I go to Coas, I get credit for half of what they would list it as. So this one is I want to say like a $20 book. It doesn't say on here. But supposing this one's like a $22 book, they're going to sell it for $11. And they're going to give me $5.50 on credit that I can use to any purchase I want. And that just like, sure, the 7.50 is better for a new book if I buy it there, but I'm not even sure that works. I think Page One says it can only be used for used books. So, yeah, this is going back into the used book system. it's going to go to Coas in Las Cruces, not to Page One Books in Albuquerque. And that's just because I prefer the one store to the other and how they treat the customer. So yeah, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.